beginning of time, we have been visited by beings we have referred to as angels, fairies, spirits, demons. We have seen strange lights and crafts in our skies. Creature sightings such as Bigfoot, the Mothman, the Jersey Devil, and others continue to be reported year after year. What is it we're seeing out there? Is this phenomenon all connected? More importantly, is it a threat? We all need a safe space in which to share our experiences, discuss the implications of the phenomena, and come together as a community of Forteans. That place is the bunker. Come and join us. And welcome back to the bunker for another exciting episode during the worldwide quarantine thanks to COVID-19. Before I get into the topic for today, I'm going to just really quick go into the statistics of the virus. I think it's just important just to really quickly touch on it. The worldwide cases are 1.5 million worldwide, 95,000 deaths. This is according to Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center. 95,455 deaths. The United States, where I am located, we have 461,437 cases. Here in my state of New Jersey, we have 1,709 deaths thus far. So, I just wanted to give out those quick stats and just let everybody know that, you know what, wherever you're at, wherever you're listening, it's happening here too. It's quite the shit show here in the United States. I'm not sure if for all the listeners that are outside of the United States, I'm not sure how much that you really see how good or bad things are going here. I'm not sure how international news really spreads and how accurate it is, but the government's response here has been abysmal, and individual states and communities are pulling together and trying to make the best of it, and are doing some great things. But as far as a national response, it's pretty bad, and we have, as many of you may know, no national healthcare system here, so that's exacerbating things here, and it's not helping the matter. But I would just want to take a second to address that. Wish everyone well. Just let you know that I'm doing this episode, but I would feel disingenuous to not touch on what's going on in my neighborhood, and just to let you know that wherever you're at in the world, we're all in this together. We're going through it right along with you. And without further ado, I want to get to our topic today, which is on tulpas, which, for those of you who are not familiar, I'm going to go into a little bit of background on the concept of tulpas, which in basic terms is a thought form. But basically, tulpa is a concept that comes from Tibetan Buddhism. It comes really from Tibet, which states that the human mind is capable of creating an object or even a being by the power of the mind, by intent alone, which then has the ability to actually break free of its creator and take on a life of its own. And like I said, in very, very simple terms, it's a thought form. It's a thought that becomes real, a thought that becomes physical. And when I was asked to tackle this topic, I was asked by another good podcast when I threw out the request for topics for this second season of The Bunker, I was asked to tackle this concept of tulpas and thought forms. And I have a little bit of experience with this concept, just being a paranormal investigator. I've come across some phenomena that you could say falls into this category of a thought form. And, we'll get into that in a little bit. But what I wanted to do first was to kind of go into, being someone who has studied Buddhism a little bit, I wanted to go into the background of Tibetan Buddhism and flesh out the sort of context from which the tulpa actually originates. Like I said, it comes from Tibetan Buddhism. And Tibet is a mysterious place that... It was a culture that was sort of very isolated and was sort of flavored by shamanism pre-Buddhism, before Buddhism came into, before Buddhism essentially came over the Himalayas and into Tibet. And just to give some background on Tibetan Buddhism is a Mahayana system of Buddhism, or in other words, large boat or large vehicle Buddhism. And the aim of the Mahayana is to achieve an awakened state through practice, through yoga, meditation, through the practice of the system of Buddhism, in order to become a bodhisattva, become an awakened one, to walk the path and to find a measure of enlightenment, not so that you can benefit from it, but so that you could then turn around and extend those teachings and that experience to others, and thereby spreading that experience of awakening to others. Hence the term large vehicle or large vessel, large boat Buddhism. It's a very pluralistic system that is rooted in arduous practice, in compassion, and the whole goal, like I said, was to reach a certain state of enlightenment so that you could then turn around and then drag others along with you to pass along the gift of enlightenment to others. I often think of it as a almost like what is the thing I'm trying to think of the like Tough Mudder kind of approach to Buddhism. And it's like you're working with others to ascend this wall, and you're covered in mud and dirt. You get to the top of the wall, and do you continue running off by yourself? No, you get to the top of the wall. Your first instinct is to turn around. You extend a hand to someone else and pull them up the wall too. And so that's, in very simple terms, that's kind of what modern Tibetan Buddhism, its approach to the practice of Buddhism in general, is looked at and practiced. And Tibet, like I said, is a very interesting place where mysticism was then sort of flavored with Buddhism. And Buddhism came over the Himalayas by many teachers over the years, but I mean, the one that is sort of given credit mostly for bringing Indian Buddhism to Tibet was Padmasambhava. And Tibet embraced Buddhism because it's a sound system of living, and it's a strong set of ethics. But it's also kind of mystical in itself. And when it came to Tibet, it really sort of, it mixed well with the shamanistic system that existed in Tibet. And one way in modern times that you can really see this mysticism come to light with Tibetan Buddhists, and if you ever get a chance to spend some time with some Tibetan monks, I highly suggest you do it. There are several different temples that exist in the United States that are of Tibetan Buddhist, that have Tibetan Buddhist roots. The one that I have visited on multiple occasions and even spent a weekend retreat at was the Kadampa World Peace Temple in upstate New York. It's fantastic. It's located in Glen Spey, New York. It's tremendous. They have all kinds of, week-long weekend retreats, and they even have larger retreats. There's a work release program, so you can go and volunteer and work on the campus, and in turn get free lessons and meals, and it's pretty great. But one way you can actually see this and witness firsthand this like system of mystical practice, even as it goes on today, is to spend some time with some monks, go to an event that is frequented by monks, like I did last year, and they have a practice where they will actually assemble a mandala for certain holidays, for certain events, as means of protection or a blessing. And if you've ever seen one of these in person, you know what I'm talking about, and it's quite impressive. And the sand mandala it's basically made up of many different intricate geometrical patterns that are made up and built with brightly colored sand. And the monks will it takes hours to create one of these things. And it's very, very minute detail, extremely impressive if you've ever seen one of these in person. If you've not seen one, you can Google images of, Tibetan sand mandala, and you can see the images yourself. But if you've ever seen one in person, the images don't do it justice, because you can see everything. It's in 3 dimensions. It's very intricate. It's very intricate and so precise in detail that it could be a precise painting, but they're making it of sand. And the building of these mandalas is in itself a meditation for the monks. And so it's an exercise in meditation for them to create it. And, it takes a long time, and it's very meticulous to build these things. The reason they're made out of sand is because it's it's a recognition of the impermanence of human life, impermanence of just everything, actually. And that's a big teaching within Buddhism, is that everything is impermanent. There's nothing that lasts. There's no need to attach to things, to emotions, to social constructs, to governments, to things that are bad. I mean, you've heard the old statement, "This too shall pass." Well, that's a very Buddhist concept, and it's the concept of impermanence. Like, everything that is right now will pass away and will change and will move on to some other stage of development. And so that's why these things are made out of sand. But it is in itself a very deep-rooted, very powerful meditation just in the creation of these things. I had the opportunity to spend some time with some monks, although it was too brief. Last year, like I said, they built a mandala in honor of their event that they were holding at a nearby old Quaker meeting house, which was pretty cool. And they have a tendency to create these mandalas for different purposes, like I said, like either for protection or for blessings or in honor of certain holidays. And what was interesting about these monks that hosted this event last year was that they were also going around to a lot of the businesses in the area, and they were actually giving blessings of protection to the different businesses. And they were also even giving individual readings, almost like, not psychic readings per se, but almost like guidance readings. And they were sitting with each person in an individual session and, sort of getting a read on that person. and listening to the person and what sort of guidance they wanted or what sort of advice they needed for whatever thing they were going through. And they were using their expertise and their level of stillness, if you will, to give guidance readings, which is a pretty mystical sort of thing. You don't tend to think of Buddhist monks doing that, but I was very, very... One, I wasn't surprised they were doing it, but I was also impressed that they were doing it at the same time, because, like I said, this Buddhist meditation from Tibet is a very mystical tradition, and the evidence is in the creation of these mandalas. I was told a story as long as we're on the topic of mandalas. I was told a story from one of my teachers that he had the opportunity to go to a village in Tibet where the monks came for a certain holiday and they created this mandala. And one of the monks actually made a comment to this teacher that basically made an implication that the mandala technically wasn't completed. Like they left out one little piece. And this teacher asked him, like, well, what's the purpose of that? Why did you leave out one element of this mandala? And the monk said matter-of-factly, well, if we had included that other little piece of this mandala and fully completed this one, then every single woman in this village would have ended up pregnant. And just said it matter-of-factly, like, as if, like, yeah, it was, wasn't boasting, wasn't bragging. Said it matter-of-factly, like, yeah, this is, we couldn't complete it because this is what would happen. So that's a pretty intense thing. And when you see these things, you don't tend to think of it like, okay, yeah, wow, that's a magical thing. That's an object of power. That's it. But if you think about it, it does make perfect sense in the sense that it's the creation of these things, and they're typically, several monks are meditating as they create this thing, and they are pouring their intent into it, and they're meditating and sometimes even chanting at the same time that they create this thing. And so it makes perfect sense because this is an object of intent. It's almost like a sigil, a very, very beautiful sigil. It's not just just one little symbol that's scribbled on a stone or something. This is something that is a work of art. But it is a powerful thing, and they take this practice very, very seriously. Another thing that's very mystical about the Tibetan approach to Buddhism is their outlook towards death. If you have ever read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or if you've ever read, which I highly recommend, another book written by a more modern monk named Solgye Rinpoche. It's called the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. Highly recommend it if you haven't read that. But it outlines the Tibetans' outlook on death and what happens to the soul upon death, and that there's this very, very detailed system of beliefs about what happens to the soul after death. And they believe that upon death, the soul then travels through these different stages of development. They call them bardos. And they're like stages, almost like little miniature realms. They're like little, I'm trying to think of another way to describe it. It's almost like different, toll booths or different little miniature areas that the soul travels through upon death. And the goal is to find its way to the light and become one with the light. But they, in the West, we tend to think like, oh yeah, when you die, there's a long tunnel and you see the light and stuff like that. And essentially that seems like it jives with the Tibetan system, but their system is much more detailed. And they feel that there are these many, many different stages the body passes through upon death. And so therefore there are all these different rituals and chants that correspond to each of these different stages of development. And once the soul, has passed through all these different stages, it's no longer attached to the body. And so therefore the body now essentially is no longer needed for that soul. It is passed on. It is no longer attached to that soul. And they have all these different mystical, rituals and so forth to go through to ensure that the soul is moved on and is no longer attached to this body. Because the fear is that if you're still attached to this body after death, that once your body is destroyed, that you will feel attachment and that you will return and then become reincarnated and have to relive another human life again. Because ultimately the goal is to pass along to the next stage in development. Their heaven, so to speak. And so once the soul in their system has passed all the stages, gone through all the bardos, and is no longer attached to the human body, the body is then put through a ritual of cleansing and so forth, at the end of which the body is then taken to a special place. It is actually then cut up into pieces with some special ritualistic, items, and they allow the body to be consumed by the vultures and taken away and consumed, and it's their way of giving the body back to the universe, because the vultures to them it's a very spiritual symbol, as well as an animal that you could say really recycles the body. It takes the rotting flesh from not only humans but from animals and uses it as food, and thereby takes the physical aspect of the body and takes it to the sky and brings it back to the earth, back into the universe. And so even in death, they have a very mystical, ritualistic way of handling things. And this is very important when we're talking about tulpas, because in order to lay this groundwork, and I think it'll be easier to understand why Buddhists would have this concept of tulpas, because it sounds like a very occult thing, and it is, and it has come into the West and has since become a very cult concept. But there's a good reason for that, and that's why I'm kind of laying all this groundwork. I wanted to give the setting of Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism in particular, because this is where this concept comes from. And now that I have laid that groundwork, I want to talk about how that then came to the West. And there was a gentleman named Walter Ealing Evans Wentz, who was an American anthropologist who traveled to Tibet to study their culture. Eventually, he actually published an English translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead way back in 1927. And in his translation, he mentions an emanation body, or thought forms. So that's like the first taste of the West of Tibetan Buddhism. And there was also another mystic, spiritualist, / Buddhist from Belgium, a Belgian / French, Alexandria David Neal, who visited Lhasa back in 1924, and she actually claimed to have witnessed this phenomena firsthand. And in her book, Magic and Mystery in Tibet, which was published back in 1929, she claims to have actually created a thought form herself while visiting there and partaking in some of these rituals. And although she partook in this activity herself and witnessed this activity and this phenomenon herself, she actually herself sort of questioned the possibility, like, could this be just illusory? Am I imagining this? Is it just in my head? But there were other people that witnessed the phenomenon also, independently of her, that also saw this thing. And she basically, what she created was like a Friar Tuck, this is the way she described it, like a Friar Tuck type monk character that she created. And the story goes that this monk character that she had created took on a life of its own, and it actually had to be tracked down by other monks, and it had to be destroyed because it had become a being in and of itself. So So now, in more modern times, the teaching of Tibetan Buddhism and its like mystical, borderline occult beliefs came into the West, more specifically into the United States, where if you think about it, for thousands of years, who was living here? The Native Americans. What was their religious practice? Shamanism. What was the practice in Tibet before Buddhism came there? Shamanism. So in a way, it makes perfect sense. It just energetically kind of lines up and really clicked. Once the Tibetan Buddhism and Buddhism in general just came here, it really just kind of exploded. And I think, to me personally, Tibetan Buddhism really clicked here because it has a kind of occult flavor. And the occult really does have a strong hold on this society. It has kind of a permanent sort of corner of the room when you think about religion or beliefs or paranormal activity, or the occult has always had a sort of corner of the room off to itself where it's been this entire time. And I think it's because that the people that have lived in this land that we're now sitting on, thousands of years, shamanism was the prevailing belief system. And Tibetan Buddhism is rooted in a very shamanistic, mystical kind of background. And I think that's why it really sort of exploded. It just took hold here. What we're going to do, I think, now at this point, is we're going to take a quick break. When we come back from the break, we're going to talk about some of my experience with thought forms and how, thoughts become form, and how this phenomenon has sort of snowballed in the United States since coming here. So I want to thank you for joining us here in the bunker. We'll be right back after this quick break. And we are back. Thanks for joining me back in the bunker during our time here in quarantine. To continue with the story, like I mentioned earlier, I became involved in the paranormal years ago, joined a group here in New Jersey, and underwent extensive training, lasted almost a year. And during that training, there was one story that was told, especially during the part of the training where we were talking about the phenomena and different manifestations of the phenomena. And when one of the topics that we talked about and were taught was thought forms and how powerful they can be. And this story that was related to me, that was, that I confirmed by speaking to multiple different people that had witnessed this. Essentially, in the group, before I had become a member, there were some members of the group that weren't getting along. And so what was taking place essentially was there was one member of the group that was being ostracized and was being, that was being judged and was being talked about in a negative way. And this was sustained. This had gone on for a while. And as a result of this person being a very, very sensitive person, as I understood it, was being talked about in a very negative way by multiple different people. And as a result, this person began to actually feel physical effects, began to have bruising show up on their body. And I even saw some images of this. And one of the leaders in the group actually had to, had to confront this issue and spoke to everyone in the group individually and ascertained that, oh, okay, I see what's going on here. This, there are some things that are some negative emotions that are floating around. This person's being talked about. And as a result, this person began to just see bruising, just out of nowhere, without hitting themselves, without falling, without having any physical trauma happen to themselves, was witnessing and was experiencing just bruises appearing all over themselves. And when the group was confronted about it, and the director basically kind of squashed the situation and said, look, this needs to stop. Once the negative emotions towards this person stopped, the bruises went away. And this is something I didn't witness in real time myself, but I was told the story by the people that witnessed it, and I brought it up to several different people, and it was confirmed that, yeah, that happened. And so that's like one little example. While I was training to be a paranormal investigator, that's something that was brought to my attention, and it was something that really was an eye-opener for me, where I had the opportunity, before I began working with clients and investigating formally, that where I really had a deep understanding and respect for thoughts and, both positive and negative, and how they can really manipulate our environment. It was an eye-opener for me. And to continue with our timeline of how, this concept of tulpas by way of Tibetan Buddhism came to the West, back in June of 2009, June 10th, 2009. It's going to get real dark, okay, just to warn you. June 10th, 2009, a character was introduced to the internet and was posted on a thread online, which was called Something Awful Internet Forum, right? Now, followers of the thread were sort of challenged to create a scary paranormal entity or a concept or, some sort of a thing of horror, right? And now most of the submissions were just an image, but there was an image that was posted. There was, I believe, a couple of images were posted, and along with some text with like the beginnings of a story. It was like a few lines of text that kind of gave a little bit of a background to this character. And the character that I'm talking about is, of course, the Slenderman. The images with this few lines of text exploded. It went viral. And became so popular that others began to contribute to this story and contribute other images and other lines of text and add, details to the story. And those of you that I'm pretty sure that most of you are familiar with the Slenderman. You've seen it somewhere, but the Slenderman then became posted on a horror site called Creepypasta. Became more and more popular. It eventually even morphed into, it became a video game and even a movie. Okay, so for those of you that don't know, what exactly is the Slenderman? You can divulge some details from the name itself, but it's real creepy, and we'll get into some details. So what exactly is the Slenderman? Okay, so it's this unnaturally tall, extremely tall, thin humanoid that is wearing a black suit. So immediately, if you're involved in any sort of paranormal thing, you're automatically thinking, ooh, that sounds kind of like Men in Black. This thing has no discernible face. It has a face that is blank, which it does actually jive with a lot of ghost stories. People that see spirits, they describe seeing a spirit, a form, torso, arms, legs, the whole thing. But there's often no face that is discernible. And so here's a fact that is rooted in a lot of stories that are already in our consciousness, right? And that's important. This being is noted to target children and young adults and kidnaps them. For what reason, we don't really know. And herein lies a part of what makes this thing so creepy, is because all the details are not fleshed out. We don't really know what this thing's intentions are. We don't know where it comes from, what it's made out of, why it's here, what it's doing. So there's a lot of details of this thing, and it's the way it manifests and what it can do, but its intent sort of remains in the shadows. And that is another fact that really makes the thing creepy. There's some other characteristics. It seems to appear near or in forests, or in or around abandoned buildings. And now when I read this, I thought like, wow, that is a brilliant concept. And the reason I say that is because growing up as a kid here in New Jersey, there were a lot of forests here in central Jersey, and there is also a lot of abandoned buildings. And that is one of the main things that kids do, as a going up into teenage years. If you find an abandoned house, the first thing you do is like, wow, man, I wonder what's in there. And you become consumed, like, man, I really want to explore that, see what's in there. And so it was kind of a brilliant concept that someone attached this entity to a forest or a abandoned building. It's a place where kids would explore by themselves without parents, for the most part, without any adult supervision being with them, and so therefore being more vulnerable. So if you wanted to make something creepy, that's where it would be. Excuse me, that's where it would be, right? Some more characteristics. This being can cause fear. It can cause paranoia. It can enter your dreams. It can cause nightmares. And therein lies another factor that's really super creepy, is that when you're asleep and you're dreaming, there's no parents there either. You're on your own. You're in your own head, right? And that's another sort of factor that is a super brilliant thing. Like if you wanted to make something creepy, I mean, I can see why this thing won as the creepiest of the creepy that anyone could come up with online, and why it exploded and why so many people became fearful of this thing, because it hits all the notes, in other words. So again, in your own dreams, like much like for my generation, the Freddy Krueger movies, you would fall asleep and you would be vulnerable to this thing, and then no one would be there to help you because you were by yourself. You're in your own head, and this thing can get you there. And that's really scary. That's really, really a scary thing, and it goes hand in hand with this abandoned building or forest locale for this thing to appear, because you were typically there as a child, a teenager, or young adult, and you're there by yourself without any adults to protect you. And like I touched on earlier, that the intent of this thing is really sort of unknown. And I think one of the reasons for that is that the formation of this character was it was a collaborative effort. Many, many, many different people contributed to this thing and gave it form, gave it, characteristics, gave it a story, but without a origin story, without a canon. You can't look up, hey, where did this thing come from? Why is this thing so scary? It's the unknowns of the thing that, to me, makes it much, much more scary. Another characteristic, it's known to recruit children to act as proxies or agents and go out and do things on its behalf. And we'll discuss the importance of this fact in a minute. And like I said, this thing went viral several months after it was created. There were even callers to the wildly popular show Coast to Coast AM calling up, inquiring about this Slenderman. So it was apparent this entity quickly became ingrained into the consciousness of the culture. I mean, it became viral online, but it got under your skin. It generated fear. And because it targets, teenagers and young adults who are already in a transitory sort of liminal stage in their development, it also is just a more, you're a lot more vulnerable in that liminal stage of your life. You're not established as an adult yet. You're not a young child that has not yet felt the sting of fear. You're not an adult where you're, for the most part, overcome your fear. You're in that middle space. You're in that liminal space, which you hear so much about these days. And so, and I think that's why this thing became so famous and so ingrained in the consciousness of the culture. And many children at this point were finding it hard to sleep because they were thinking about this thing, or they would fall asleep and they would have nightmares. And I've been referring to this Slenderman as an entity. So I think it's important right now to define what exactly do I mean by entity. Well, an entity is something with distinct and independent existence. Here is where shit gets real. On May 31st of 2014, two girls in Waukesha, Wisconsin, stabbed one of their classmates. this girl was 12 years old. They stabbed her 19 times and left her for dead. All right. Now, when thankfully she lived and told the authorities who did this. When these girls were tracked down, who committed this attempted murder, when they were questioned by the authorities, the girls afterwards claimed that they were committing the crime in order to become a proxy of the Slenderman. And here's the thing, and this is why this creature, this entity, is so creepy. They also claimed that if they didn't do this crime, if they did not commit this murder, and thankfully, the girl survived, so it was attempted murder, not murder, thankfully. But they felt that if they didn't do this, that the Slenderman would kill them and/or would come after their families. And so they were, in a way, acting out of self-preservation in some twisted way and wanted to commit this crime to become an agent of the Slenderman and thereby keeping themselves and their family safe from the wrath of this thing. Now think about that. That's a goddamn nightmare scenario. Here's these preteen girls who are driven to the point that they're willing to kill one of their classmates. Like, it is unbelievable. It's really hard to digest. Since then, the girls, I think, they eventually they were sentenced to spend many years in a mental hospital, obviously, and not serve prison time because they were deemed, not, their mental faculties were compromised in some way, which I agree with. But it makes you wonder. How committed would you have to be in their situation to do what they did? It's absolutely crazy. The one girl gave some more detail about this Slenderman entity and claimed that this Slenderman could read her mind. It was always there watching. She felt that it was always there. It was always watching her, always listening to her. It could teleport, appear and disappear, seemingly at will. Now, let's think about that for a second. This is something else that struck me. This entity had this ability to teleport, right, or apparate, which, if you think about it, that's really, teleportation is essentially the ability to travel at the speed of thought. And, we're talking about a thought form here. But this, you can say, oh, they're just crazy. You can, and I wouldn't totally blame you for saying that, because what they did was crazy. And this being was something that was created online, so it couldn't possibly be real, right? But to them, it was real as anything. To them, it was so real, they were willing to kill someone. They believed wholeheartedly in this entity. So much so that they were willing to kill somebody. I mean, what a nightmare that is. I mean, that sounds literally like a horror movie. And so that's kind of to me, that's almost the peak of the dark side of a thought form, to me. Like, I'm sure there's other cases of it out there. But here's the thing. Many other people have reported seeing this creature, this entity, and were petrified by it. So these girls aren't the only ones that have reported seeing this thing. This thing's beginning to show up now. There are reports of it happening. People are calling into Coast to Coast AM because they're seeing this thing. And other people are seeing it. So at what point did this thing make a jump to some, horror character on a website and then suddenly become so real that kids are petrified, adults are terrified. Some adults are seeing this thing too. And some kids are willing to kill for this thing. At some point, this thought form, just like the Wentz character of Friar Tuck, became real, became a physical being that needed to be hunted down and destroyed. At some point, this thing became an entity. It became an entity. and to again, like, go into a little bit of, my experience with thought forms. I, along with Beth, worked on a case recently where we were called up by a woman who was having some paranormal activity in her home. She was scared. her kids were seeing this as well. Her mother was seeing things, also experiencing things. So it wasn't just her. There were multiple people in the home hearing and seeing and feeling things, and they were afraid. And so we went and investigated. We took, bit of walkthrough. We did some recording, found some strange voices, had some strange feelings of our own. And this was a complicated case in the sense that there was some activity that they were frightened by. There were some strange objects that were found on the property that we needed to dispose of. But once we got into investigating the activity, it became apparent that one of the facets of the phenomena was that there was an entity that was becoming physical. And I'm being vague, and I'm not giving names on purpose for anonymity's sake, but there was a being that was crawling into bed with someone and was doing physical things to this person and was terrifying them as a result, obviously, right? The thing is that once we dug into the case, once we questioned her more and more fully, we figured out that this entity was real, 100% real to her. She was terrified. But this was a thought form. This was a thought form that she herself created as a result of some loneliness issues, some marital issues. There were deep, very, very disturbing and very, very troubling emotional things going on here that resulted in the creation of a thought form. And we consulted with several other people independently. They came to the same assertion. When we questioned the person about emotionally where they were at and what was going on, they broke down and admitted, yeah, this is going on. And really almost said like, yeah, I'm probably doing, I'm doing this. And here's the important thing, is that we completed the case. We got rid of the strange objects that we all had some weird feelings about. We got rid of those. But then we had this person confront her emotional issues and did a cleansing of the home and a clearing and a blessing, and had her contribute and participate with us so that she herself used her intent to banish this thing, to get rid of it, to change up her emotional state and partake in the cleansing herself so that she could empower herself and force this thing out, get rid of this thing that she, once she had realized, created herself because of what she was going through emotionally, right? And once she did that, this thing was dispelled and it was gone. And we have checked in with her multiple times since then, and this took care of the problem. And now, a skeptic will say, well, it was just all in her head and she just had to, well, no, I saw in her eyes. She, in the beginning, was convinced that there was an entity that was violating her. And I could see in her eyes, she was petrified. This thing was real. It was real. And it wasn't until she acknowledged that this thing was real, but that she had created it too. She had poured this negative emotional energy into the situation and contributed to this thing. And it's when she acknowledged that and turned her emotion around and stamped this thing out, it was gone. But it was real. When you see someone, you look them in the eye and you can see it, they're scared. They're not making it up. It's real. For these two girls that were willing to kill their classmate, it was real. You don't kill someone on just like a whim or like some concept that you just like, something you read in a comic book and like, oh wow, this is cool, let's go kill someone. No, it doesn't work like that. If you're pushed to that point, this shit's real. And I've never had to deal with anything that dark to that level where a murder or attempted murder was committed. But in concept, I can see the parallels. I can see that this is related. And I've heard of a concept in the paranormal where people will say, if a client is experiencing a haunting and they have a home where their wiring is not properly grounded, and so you have this very, very high level of ambient EMF, or in other words, like all this energy in the air. There's a theory that it's obviously going to affect a person physically if you're around it all the time, but there's also a theory that an entity can use that energy as a battery and can more prominently manifest, right? Well, I think in this case that we worked on, I feel like this person's fear and emotional state was the battery for this thing. And that once she confronted it and she cut off the fear that was feeding this thing, that it went away. So that's how I kind of look at it. But long story short, she's good now. The thing is done. She's much happier, which is great. And that's the satisfying part of, helping people with paranormal issues. Paranormal issues. And what you end up doing sometimes is, almost, you almost end up like a counselor in a way too, because you're walking people through like the root cause of a lot of this activity. Is sometimes it's just some dark, emotional, heavy stuff that's going on with them, and when you address that stuff, that's the source of it, and then that makes it kind of go away. And that doesn't, I'm not saying that means it's not real. It's extremely real. It's, it's like that power source. When you cut off the power source to something, it dispels it. And one thing I was thinking about too is when you think about the, just the basic of like the biology of the human body and the mind, when you think about how the brain works and how the body works, this actually makes a lot of sense, because our thoughts, which are tied to our emotions, are really the result of chemical reactions in the brain. So that's an electrical system. And the processes of the body is kind of a chemistry experiment, which is connected to an electrical system. So I was thinking of this the other day, and if you had a scientist that was running an experiment where he took a beaker or some kind of container and he filled it up with chemicals, and then subjected shot some electrical pulses into certain chemicals, and you're going to get an explosion. You're going to get some kind of radical physical reaction, right? Depending on what the chemicals are and how much electricity is, injected into it and so forth. But it makes a lot of sense. That's what our human body is. Our mind is an electrical device. Our whole entire nervous system is electrical. And then you have the chemistry of our digestive system and endocrine system. It's biology. It's chemistry. It's electricity. All this stuff going on inside of ourselves, and it makes a lot of sense. Every one of our thoughts is a little zap of energy. And if you're in a situation where you're in dire straits, if you're in a very, very poor emotional state, if you're being held prisoner, if you're being tortured, if you're in some kind of state where you have like this constant, sustained, negative emotional state, there are stories of people making things physically happen in their environment. So if it makes sense to put a potion of all these different mixture of things in a beaker and shoot it with electricity and we watch it explode, under that context, you say, "Oh yeah, that makes perfect sense." That's chemistry. But why should we be so dismissive of it if it happens inside of our body, if it happens in our environment as a result of what's going on in our body? I like to think of it in general terms like that, and it seems to make more sense to me. But anyway, to bring it back to the practice of Buddhism, though, there is a set of 8 precepts, basically, in Buddhism, 8 tenets that were laid out by the Buddha himself, like 500 BC approximately. And the precepts are as follows: right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, right? Now, if you'll notice, there are 4 aspects that are, you could say, are external physical precepts, and there are 4 that are internal precepts. And it's kind of interesting that right there in the lessons and the precepts of Buddhism, they address right thought, because I think that there's a recognition that even if you don't hurt someone, and you can read this in Buddhist literature all over the place, even if you think about hurting the person, that is violence. Just the thought of violence on a certain level is itself violence to the Buddhist. And so it would make sense if you think about, if it's this concept is coming from the people who literally believe if you pour enough intent into something that you can create something out of thought. You can create something, really, really good. You can create something really, really bad. And so it would make sense from a Buddhist perspective that therefore you need to watch your thoughts. It's a more universal accepted theory that, yeah, sure, you shouldn't walk around punching people, you shouldn't hurt people, you shouldn't murder people, but even the thought of it itself is another level, a more subtle level of violence, but it is still violence. And they look at it like that, and they take that very, very seriously. And it makes sense if you think about, this is coming from a culture that believes in tulpas. I wanted to actually close out the show by just reading an excerpt from my Buddhist handbook by John Snelling. And it's the beginning of the chapter on the Buddhist worldview. I thought this was pretty interesting. And the chapter begins thus. Before we set out to explore the Buddhist teaching in detail, it is important to get a clear picture of his view of the world. By world, in quotes, we do not merely mean the physical world, but the psychological and spiritual worlds as well, which in traditional Buddhist cosmology are regarded as interlocking. I thought that was a very important point when you're thinking about tulpas. So thoughts in the Buddhist sense is almost automatically in existence on a different level, on a very subtle level. And it's just, in order to create a tulpa, it's almost just a matter of a focused intent and or ritual, and that's really all it takes to create something that is autonomous, something that could take on a life of its own. Very interesting stuff. I encourage everyone, like I said, to go out and read the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Very interesting read. Or the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying by Solgyur Rinpoche. Especially if you, like I have, had many people in their lives pass away. It's a very interesting read, and it gives a lot of insight into the Tibetan Buddhist in particular, outlook towards death and the spirit and the universe and how everything is connected and how thoughts are connected to matter and vice versa. Interesting stuff. So if any of you out there have had any sort of experience with a tulpa, you believe you've come in contact with a tulpa, if you've ever come in contact with the Slenderman, with any kind of being that you feel is not a physical being, but perhaps a thought form, if you've ever been affected by a thought form, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at mailtothebunker@gmail.com. Love to hear your story. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. Remember, we're all in this together, and we'll get through it. Cheers. I want to thank you for tuning in to another episode in the bunker. If you enjoy this podcast, there are a few things that you can do to help support the show. If you're on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, you can leave us a 5-star rating and review, and this will help others to find the bunker and the safety that it provides. And the podcast is free to listen, but it isn't free to create. So I urge you that if you enjoy the podcast, go to our homepage and click that support tab and just help support the show. This will allow us to provide much more content moving forward. You can also just share our page on social media. The Bunker is located on Twitter at InTheBunkerCast. Again, that is InTheBunkerCast on Twitter. Also, you can send us a direct email at mailtothebunker@gmail.com. That's mailtothebunker@gmail.com. If you're experiencing some strange activity or just want to tell your story, feel free to shoot us a message either on Twitter or at Gmail. Again, I want to thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next time in the bunker.